Hi, Debbie.
Hi, Frank.
Uh, really, thanks for taking some time out of your really hectic schedule to talk to me. I've actually wanting to do this interview for a couple of weeks or months now, so I'm really happy it's finally happening. And the sun just came out, so
Oh,
I'm delighted by the sun. Um, I wanted to start with the past, if you don't mind, because I think it's sort of understanding the past is crucial to understanding the present and maybe to work on a better future. I went to the website of the organization you founded in 1992, Sisters Inside, and I read something that I think is crucial. It says our environment and life circumstances play a major role in how we behave. And I think I'd like to tell us briefly about your past and what happened to you, I think, in the mid-80s, and how you ended up sort of spending, I think, 6 years, right, in jail, if you don't mind.
sure. Yeah, so thanks for having me. The sun's gone down here, so it's nighttime here in Australia. Before we talk, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land here, Meanjin, Yagara, Yugara and Turrbal people, and where I reside on unceded stolen land of Nulunpul. I said earlier my granddaughter might come for a visit to say hello. You say hello and then we can get on with the story.
Hey.
That's Frank.
Hiya.
This is Pipey. You got to sit there quiet and listen to Nana. Okay.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Okay, early childhood. So when I grew up in a very poor family, so working class poverty, and went to the local Catholic school because in them days I would let poor kids go to the Catholic schools. From a very young age, I was always challenged the status quo. I was one of those children that annoyed everyone by asking the why question. So, you know, we'd get the cuts, like the big leather strap from the nuns for climbing up the big tree in the back of the schoolyard. And she's all right. She can sit there quiet. Sorry. This is just a way of life here. Anyway, so it gets 6 of the best for climbing the tree. And then I used to always say to the nuns, even when I was a 5-year-old, you know, why can't I climb the tree? The boys are climbing the tree. And they said, no, only boys are allowed to do that. Girls aren't allowed that. Well, why can boys do that? Why can't girls do that? So, you know, I remember that injustice from a very young age. By the time I'd finished primary school, I'd argued with my parents to let me go to the local sort of state school, which I went. And I was always a year younger than the other children because I started school as a 5-year-old. You know, my birthday's in January, so I had only just turned 5. And so I went to that high school, and within a few months I was hanging around some other kids, and we would just take off from school because school was boring. It didn't engage me. And so, you know, we used to head into the valley, which is sort of a place where you went, where there was a pool hall, pinball machines, you know, the jukebox, and listen to like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and, you know, all that type of stuff back in the 70s. So what had happened was it was a new team had been developed by the police called Juvenile Aid Bureau. So what they did, and we see that now with policing about how we're trying to, the state's trying to engage mental health workers or social workers to work with cops, and, you know, but this is the first time this sort of happened. So in the 70s, where a Juvenile Aid Bureau, where they had social workers working with police for kids who weren't engaging in school. And they came to my house. They'd convinced my parents to sign me away to go to the youth prison for 4 weeks to do an assessment, because in them days the youth prison was run by health authorities, and so a psychiatrist would have the power to release you or keep you in. So I went there for 4 weeks, and when the cops came home to my house in the morning up the back stairs, I'm in my school uniform, you know, I'm a 13-year-old kid, and they're going, you need to come with us. And, you know, it was typical that once again, adults didn't make much sense to me. They'd say one thing, do another thing. They'd tell me to go to school. This day I was dressed to go to school, but this time they wanted to take me and, you know, lock me up in a youth prison. And so I was really lucky growing up. I didn't grow up, even though we were very poor, there wasn't any violence in our home, where, you know, many of my sisters grew up where there's horrific violence in their home, physical and sexual, emotional violence. But as soon as I hit that prison, you know, that's where I learned about violence very quickly. It was a very violent institution, and because I would challenge and ask the why questions all the time, I would spend most of the time in solitary confinement. When it was time for me after that 4 weeks for the assessment, and Mum still says today, and she's in her 80s, she never received any assessment. And, you know, that's the furphy, that police lie, social workers lie. It's just about the prison industrial complex pipelining poor children into the prison system. They wouldn't let me go home. So I had to go to like this halfway sort of house in the community. So myself and the other girls, we just used to take off and, you know, run the streets basically and survive on the streets and, you know, do things, you know, steal food or whatever we needed to do to survive, to feed ourselves or to shelter ourselves. And so then I was in and out of the youth prison system right up until, you know, I was 16. And when I was 17, because back in them days, 17, you were deemed an adult. I ended up in Bogger Road, which is notorious adult prison for women. And so from that, you know, like I'd been in and out of the prison and then in the adult system. And so when I was 27, I was arrested for drug trafficking. And that's the last time I was arrested for any offences. And in 1989, for those offences, I was it was a mandatory life sentence was the penalty. And by the time I got to court and the trial to start, prosecutions did a deal with my lawyers, as we see deals done all the time, where they drop certain charges if I plead guilty to other charges, which I did because they took the mandatory life sentence off the table and I got sentenced to 6 years. So when I arrived at the prison, because at that stage, my husband, Joe, who we're still married today, he was a high-profile football player, but he was raised in an orphanage. His mother was run over by a drunk driver when he was 2 years old, and within 36 hours, him and his two siblings were put in an orphanage and raised in that orphanage. And but he was a very talented football player. And so I think when I hit the prison at that time, that last time, the prison officers thought they were, you know, they were going to give me a hard time. They did give me a hard time. And it was a prison when there was no electricity in cells. Everything was run on batteries. So they'd, you know, take your batteries out of your jukebox, you know, rock box, we'd call them back in them days. You know, they'd have the main switch of electricity. They'd turn the lights off early at night, so you had no light to see or read anything. And so they, you know, tried to stir up because they thought, oh, we'll just teach this high-profile football player's wife a lesson. Little did they know that I'd been in and out of these prison systems for a long time. And, of course, all the women that were in the adult system were the girls that I grew up with in the youth prison. And so when I was sentenced, that was in October, and it's just about coming up an anniversary, actually, in a week and a bit. But in early January, my close friend we got grabbed from behind by a couple of other women, and her name was Debbie too. And I could get out of the stranglehold and get up, but Debbie couldn't. She was a lot smaller than me, and Storm had stabbed her numerous times. And by the time I got out of my chokehold and picked up the chair and hit Storm, because Storm had gone into like a really dark place. You could see that she just wasn't there. And when I hit her over the back with the chair, she sort of snapped out of it and went, oh, and ran. And Debbie slumped to the floor. And by that time, ambulances are called and we were both taken to the hospital. Just give me to Raymond, do you want to come and get her? She's gone to sleep. Oh, no, she's woken up now. Okay, so we were taken to the hospital, and when I arrived at the hospital, because I was stabbed twice, but they used sharpened barbecue forks that they'd got from the kitchen, and prison officers knew. Do you want to go, Dan? No, okay. Prison officers knew that they had the fork, that Storm had the forks and was sharpening them. They were in clear sight when you look through the cell window, and no prison officer took them. So they actually were party. you know, well, we know that they are serial murderers and serial rapists, the prison system. So, you know, they facilitated this and allowed this to happen. When I was in the hospital, like I said, I was lucky that the 2 stabs that I got, they hit my ribs. So I didn't have any more injuries, but Debbie, they got her to the operating theatre and she had died. So that's still quite heavy, even today, to think about that. And it was the first murder in a women's prison, and it's the actually only murder still in a women's prison, which is, thank God for that, if you can say that. Not that I believe in God, but, you know, but yeah. And it was interesting because back then in 1990, no one really knew that women were in prison. And here is this murder that happened in a women's prison of a woman's, you know, killing another woman inside, and it made international news and local and you know, the news across this country. And people were saying, wow, we didn't even know women existed in the prison system. And so there was a bit of a spotlight then about that. What happened then is typical in prison culture, because prisons are violent, is that it had to be payback. You know, that's how you survive in prison. Those of us that have been in prison understand the culture, that it's violent, and if someone hurts you or a close friend, that there must be payback. That's how it plays out. And usually screws, the prison officers facilitate that payback. And at one stage there, you know, knives were stolen from the kitchen, and it was interesting. The do-gooders that we call them here, like social workers, etc., from outside in the free world, decided to come in and see what they could do for us inside, and wanted to do like a healing circle, like conflict resolution between us, a group of us, and Storm and her friends, which was never going to work. They wanted to do that within a matter of, you know, months after a murder in a prison. They had no idea, but they walked in and facilitated this process. And we were more than happy to go up to the chapel to participate, but it was going to be a bloodbath that day. It's only that one old screw who'd been around in the system for 30 years was standing at the chapel door and said, basically, where the fuck do you think yous are going? It's like, we're going in here for some mediation, conflict resolution. He said, be fucked ya, get. And he booted us off.
Debbie, there's so much already in what you've said that I guess we can talk about. I mean, for me, listening to you, like people that end up in prison, there is race in it, obviously, and there's class as well, right?
Absolutely.
Not everybody goes to jail, right? You know, the sort of the white collars often don't end up in jail, but depending on where you're coming from, and you've explained your sort of childhood and stuff, and also the fact that you were married with Joe, who was Indigenous Australian. It's clear that there is race and class, and I mean, you've mentioned Joe going to an orphanage. I mean, we can go back obviously to the stolen generation and things like that, and the fact that Australia and like all colonial empires like tried to whiten, right, the sort of the black Indigenous population. But I wanted to ask you, because I know, I mean, you're now a lawyer, and your story is pretty incredible and extraordinary, because we can call it this way, because actually you're the only former felon or convicted drug trafficker to become a lawyer. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to do a jump from the past to the present, because I think it's linked, obviously. You, the lawyer now for the family of Sherry Fisher Tilburus, right, who was left to die in a police station. So I wanted to ask you, in a way, what has anything changed, you know, between your time as a felon and your time as a lawyer? It's been 30 years or more, and what's happened to Sherry? Is it something? Can you say it's an extraordinary event, or you can see now as a lawyer an activist, that it's something actually systemic?
Yeah, like growing up in prisons, you know, you become so institutionalized that you are actively resisting and trying to get things changed for the better for while you're in the prison. Yeah. So fundamentally, you're a reformist. But I mean, it wasn't until I was released and we set up Sisters Inside, and Sisters Inside was had to be about all women. It couldn't be all women except Storm because she murdered my friend. Like, she got a life sentence for that. She pleaded guilty. So I had to resolve that issue with Storm, and so we did that in the group of Sisters Inside management committee when we would go in there every month. And Storm became a very close friend of mine, and I advocated for her parole, and she's been released for some time now, and she's a close friend. But we did that transformative justice, if you like, ourselves. No one facilitated that. We did that. But over the years, since colonisation of this country, it's been an ongoing genocide project of the state, and we continue to see that. So Aunty Sherry's death in the watch house is just the ongoing genocide of Aboriginal people in this country, First Nations people in this country. So it wasn't an extraordinary event. It was, tragically, what happens, continue to happen, and will happen again until we dismantle the prison industrial complex, until we hand back the land to the rightful owners in this country. We have legislation of native title where Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people can argue to get their land back, but it's in the construct of white law, where you have to prove that you have links to the actual land. But I mean, because of the invasion of this country, Aboriginal and Torres Strait people were moved off their land, so they can't prove that. But, so land rights is very different to native title. And so that's why we call, alongside First Nations people in this country, to hand back the land to the rightful owners so that they can be the customary owners of the land and look after the land. I know that a lot of white fellas get very fearful of that, but if they understood what Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people mean when they talk about land rights and their connection to land, they would understand. And we also need like a truth and justice or truth and reconciliation process, so that the truth of the invasion of this country is actually exposed for what it is, instead of the ongoing invisibleness that continues in everything that happens. And so what we see, because of racial capitalism, is in the criminal punishment system, for example, the very individualisation of an issue. So Aunty Sherry's death becomes her as an individual only, and not part of the bigger picture of the racial capitalist world that we live in. And so therefore, then individuals get the blame, scapegoated in regards to her death. The state will never take responsibility, and within that, the state, I mean, police and prisons will never be held accountable, because they'll actually blame an individual for an individual's death, or they call it natural. And in this case, at the moment, Aunty Sherry's death is said that she's died of natural causes. Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing natural about being in a watch house. That's what we call them here, a police watch house, and dying in a cold concrete cell. There's nothing natural about that. She showed up at that watch house at just before 4 a.m. on the previous Sunday, very unwell. And I haven't watched the CCTV footage yet from there because we don't have it. It hasn't been disclosed to us. But we know that she was unwell because I've spoken to all the women who were in the watch house with her. And she should have been immediately taken to the hospital. But she's not, because of racism. She's actually left in a cell to be sick for days, where eventually, she agrees to see a nurse on the Wednesday. We're not sure what happens there. But then they say that they find her body, after 6 a.m. on the Thursday morning. But she had been dead for many, many hours because rigor mortis had set in. And it's actually horrific. And, to sit with her family to watch that CCTV footage of the last 12 hours, of her being alive to where we believe that she died, and then being found is so traumatizing for that family, but so traumatizing again across this country for First Nations people, because the deaths continue, and then, you know, the layers of that trauma that Aboriginal people, Torres Strait people hold is horrendous. And, you know, and we see the criminal punishment system time and time again continue the same practices that ensure that someone else is going to die in a watch house or a prison cell.
It's again, like actually I watched a documentary yesterday that premiered at the BFI London Film Festival by a friend of mine, an activist called Ken Farrow. It's called Ultra Violence, and it's about death in police custody in the UK. I'll talk to Ken and see if we can send you the link, because everything you talked about is in the film as well. The CCTV images of a UK citizen dying in a police station, not even in a cell, in front of the reception area, right? They drag him from the street, and actually they drag him from the hospital where he should have stayed because he's bleeding heavily from the head, and they let him, he's like lying on the floor. There's a reception area. The cops are just talking, oh, he's play acting, etc. And they let him die. And 15 minutes later, finally, they go, oh, maybe you should check his pulse. And the guy is dead. And I think with what's happening in the US also, police violence, the death of the killing of George Floyd, and the fact that, and I was listening to a conversation between Angela Davis, a common friend, and Astra Taylor a couple of days ago, where Angela was saying the fact that we can talk about abolition, defunding the police now, is something we should really grab a hold of. Because watching the documentary yesterday, Ken's documentary, my reaction was like, why someone that was obviously unwell, and there's other example with someone with like psychiatric problems, why is the police coming? Why is not like a health worker? Why the hospital is not called? Why do we call the police? Mostly, again, when it comes to Black, Brown, Hispanic, Aboriginal people, we won't call the police if it's a white or guy or woman. And it shows that, I mean, defunding the police, abolition of the police, is about giving also money to other means to actually help these people, right? And you don't have to, I mean, you've mentioned for Sherry, like she should have been in a health institution or checked by medics, right? Not by the police. So this is a very institutionalized and broad problem that we're talking about, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, it's tragic all the way around. And, you know, earlier this year, like last year, I think, anyway, this year's gone so quickly, I was at the Free Her conference in the US with Andrea and Kathy Bodine and many. And so when I'm on a plane, I think a lot. So, you know, I come up with ideas. I'm like the ideas person. And I'll come back and I'll say to, you know, everyone at Sisters Inside, I've got an idea, and they're like, oh my God. Anyway, but, you know, I come up with this idea about a women's centre. I didn't have any other name. I called it a women's centre. It was easy just to be able to talk about that, articulate that, where, you know, as a someone who wants to abolish the prison industrial complex, people ask, how do you do that? And it's like, well, abolition is the destiny, and for me, decarceration is the journey, right? And so, you know, Sisters Inside, we're in the prison every day, the women's prisons, we're in the children's prisons, we're in the watch houses, you know, so we're in the courts, we're everywhere you can possibly think of along that criminal punishment system. But before that, that's where we've got to stop the criminalisation of women and girls. And so the Women's Centre idea, and I turned it into a written proposal and gave it to the government. So it's a bit different here. We don't have big philanthropic funders here at all. So governments fund our ideas, or they have ideas and, you know, policy, and they fund, and you can tender for that. But the idea was to have a women's centre where, because we're in the watch house, so we assist every woman in the biggest watch house in our jurisdiction to get them released. So staff are in there every morning, seeing every woman. They work with their lawyers, the defence lawyers. They see because the police are the prosecutors, what is it they want? What is it they're asking the judicial officer to put in place to allow Mary to be released on bail? And they might say, well, we want an address because a lot of the women are homeless, or they might need mental health support or drug rehab. And so we'll organise that very quickly in the morning. So when it comes before the judicial officer, they're actually released in the community and they don't go to prison. And so that's been very successful. But it's like, how do we stop the cops taking them to the watch house so they're not arrested at all? And the idea is that the women come directly to the women's centre, and then they can, no matter what time, it's run 24 hours, and they can stay there. And during like office hours, when other organisations are open, we can actually get them into accommodation, get them to the hospital if they need to at that time, or rehab, or whatever it is, that they need, that they direct. Because, we work from a position of power with, not power over. It's about women voluntarily working with us. We're not a statutory body. We would never be that because we're abolitionists. But and I was just thinking, that with heavy heart, I know if the government would have funded that early this year, which it got right to the end, and then there was a political upheaval with certain members of parliament in the government, and it just and then COVID happened, and it sort of fizzled away because of that. If that was funded, Auntie Sherry would have been brought to us. Would have came to the women's centre, and maybe she still may have died. I don't know, but at least she would have died in a hospital, or she would have died outside with her family, not in a cold concrete cell. So it's about thinking about all those ways of decarceration that we undertake through that process. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, you did. You did. And I mean, it's so, it's such, in a way, an organic process, right? You're talking about, being the one with ideas, but I think, in a way, as activists, we constantly need to be on our toes, right? And have ideas, because the, the enemy is so sometimes unpalatable, untouchable, and you can't even see who or where he is, that we need to constantly think of creative ideas. And they
take our ideas and turn them into reformist ideas, but use our abolitionist language and make out that that they're actually, no, this is a decarceration strategy. It's like, no, it's not. It's like, you can call it that, but your actions are not that. So in practice, you know what I mean? But it's interesting how they try and rearrange the deck chairs, of the Titanic, but take ours there, so it's still the sinking ship. Yeah.
But you mentioned, as if sort of things were not bad enough, COVID-19 sort of arrived early this year. You mentioned, I've read some of your interviews, and you mentioned your time in jail with women starving, no food, women fighting for food, overcrowded prisons that have got, in terms of health and hygiene, it's not, you can't call this a space to live in anyway. But can you tell me sort of about the state of prison in Australia right now? Because I was reading that Australia prison system, like the US one, and is very overcrowded to this day, right? 40,000 prisoners in New South Wales and only 6,000 cells. Queensland prisons are over capacity by 20%. So when you've got such an overcrowded space, and now you asking people to, socially or physically distance. So what does COVID means when it hits Australian prisons?
Well, you can't physically distance in an overcrowded prison. That's the reality. And, the response here was to basically lock the prisons down and not let anybody in or out. But that was a lie. That was their marketing strategy, which actually worked. And it even worked through the court system, because even the police commissioner, for example, because they have all the prosecutors in the lower courts, wrote to corrective services, right, who runs the prisons, to ask are prisons safe, you know, because defence lawyers are coming to court and saying COVID's a risk, someone will die, we don't have the death penalty, you must release people, you must not put people in prison now. So the two government bodies, cops and prisons, write to each other officially and formally and write, you know, 4 or 5 page letter back, and corrective services documents their strategy about stopping COVID-19 entering the prisons, which we know that you can't do because prison officers are moving in and out all the time, as well as other staff that are employed by the prison system. Yes, they stopped all the visits, they stopped all the children coming in, even though children could still go to kindergarten and school, they weren't allowed to go to prison. You know, they're safe, they don't get COVID, but couldn't go see mum. So, you know, that other layer of punishment that continues. They couldn't see any any organisation, like Sisters Inside staff or any other staff. They couldn't see lawyers, like lawyers couldn't go in. So, you know, there was a whole heap of issues. But prison officers are moving in and out. And basically everyone, when it got to like stage 3 and 4 more recently, because COVID was in the youth prison, and then it was at the training centre, like Screw School, we call it, and they go into the prison, the men's prison, so it's in there. But they're saying no one in the prison, like no people in prison who are in prison have COVID. And like I said to the minister, well, have you tested everybody? Why don't you test everybody? It's like, oh no, the chief medical officer says we don't have to test everybody. So then they hide behind the chief medical officer. They have a formal letter to present to judicial officers to say that there's a COVID plan for safety, so you can send people to prison, for example. And, you know, and they market this to the community. And what we see is we don't actually know if anyone in the prison has COVID or not. I would say they have had it. People have had symptoms. They have tested some people, isolated. But everyone, it's been another layer of punishment, of solitary confinement, to the point where, you know, we saw the response, the resistance from the men in one of the men's prisons, where they set it on fire, they flooded the cells, they smashed the windows and threw everything out, you know, out of the windows onto the grassed area so that the media could get photographs. And, you know, that was a cry out of help, because people were getting only 1 meal a day, they weren't getting medication, you know, they were, like you said, lucky to be fed. There's no soap in there, even though corrective services said we have plenty of soap. It's like, well, give them the soap. You know, they say, well, they can buy the soap. We give them their first cake for free when they first enter prison, but you can buy the soap. But if you're in solitary confinement, you can't do anything, and you're sharing cells with other people. So, and solitary confinement, as we all know, who have, those of us that have been in solitary confinement and those that have been in prison, we know it's the most horrific experience, and our mental health, you know, decompensates very quickly. And it's like when the screws come to get you, to put you in solitary confinement, you fight, and you fight for your life, because you actually don't want to be locked up in that cell and isolated, you know, for whether it's a day, 10 days, 10 years. And here what happens is, you know, you'll have 6 or 8 screws holding you down. For women, cut your clothes off, put you in body shackles, maybe put a spit hood over your head and drag you to solitary confinement. The only response that you have is to spit or to bite, because that's all you've got left when you're shackled, and then you'll get charged for criminal offences against screws. What we saw, corrective services frame up the men and their resistance as a riot, where what it was a group resistance to not be wanting to be in solitary confinement. But no one sees that, because the machine of the prison industry is so huge, it has so much money to market, to say they're criminals, they're violent, this is a riot, etc. Where we know, and speaking to, you know, some of the men in there that, you know, my law firm represents, they were desperate, you know, because they weren't being fed, they couldn't wash their clothes, they couldn't wash their sheets, like it was impossible to keep clean. There's no soap, you know. Toilets are backing up, you know, things like that because of the overcrowding. So it's just horrific. And so, but still to this day, even though we're back to stage one of it's the corrective services plan, which is everybody's allowed back in the prison, as in lawyers, services, families, etc. You know, they've modelled themselves at how wonderful they are to keep COVID out of the prison. I don't believe COVID was out of the prison. Prison officers had it. Staff at, you know, in the youth prison had it. And, you know, if you tested everyone, gave them a blood test, I'd put money on that they'd have antibodies, as I do to COVID. And it's just that they weren't tested and they weren't treated and they weren't supported in a health framework. They were left in solitary confinement in a punishment model that actually like terrified them and broke them down in a way that they had to resist in the way that they did, whether it was setting fires, flooding, smashing windows, you know. And the most horrific thing is the trauma that women, that overlay of not being able to speak to your children, hold your children, even talk to your children on the phone.
Thanks, Debbie. I mean, there's again so much I want to talk about following what you've said. A big part of your job as an activist is to educate people as well, right? Educate sort of the mainstream, the general public about what prisons are. Listening to you, and when you talked about riots and women sort of fighting and biting screws, in a way, it seems quite obvious that when you put someone in a cage, the only response can be rage, right? And that's what prisons are about. It's about putting people in cages, and it's about denying life to these people. Because when you put someone in jail for 25 years, it's not only him or her who's in jail for 25 years, you put her family in jail for 25 years and her kids in jail for 25 years. So this sort of denying of humanity is something that really, in a way, cannot produce anything good, right? I don't see how you can put someone in a cage for 25 years and then release him or her and expect that this person is going to be an enlightened or a better person. And so I wanted to ask you, in a way we can end on this, because it's going to be a multi-layered question, I guess. We know governments, when there is overcrowding, they build more prisons. We know that because of the prison industrial complex, it's like a hotel, right? When you build a hotel, you want to fill it. When you build a prison, you want to fill it. So in a way, you always get more people in prisons because we build more prisons. But you said that for you, prisons represented a failure of justice. And also, we really live in a time of sort of law and order hysteria, right? I mean, you can see it in the US, it's quite obvious, but all over the world. It's fomented by politicians, it's fomented by the media, as you've just said, that will show a riot or a prison burning without explaining why it's burning and why there's a riot. So anyway, I want to end on this, but I know it's going to be probably a long answer, and that's in a way what I'm looking for. Because so how can you help as an activist, but also as a lawyer now, in a way, educating the public in this moment about sentencing, about prison, and about what it means for a human being?
You know, I think one of the things that we all have to do, and what I encourage people to do, is we have to dismantle the police officer in our own minds. You know, like the world we live in, we rely on the state to respond to everything, where we have become the sheep of the state, where we can't even sit down and have a conversation to resolve conflict with each other anymore unless we call the cops, and, you know, we know the cops will escalate anything. You know, what has happened to the skills of us that are human beings, just like those that put blue uniforms on and give them the power? So, you know, I talk to people about building a community that's different to the community that we live in, because that's the only way that we can do it. The community that we have now is not responding in a way that is healthy for anybody, because more and more people are becoming disposable humans, whether they're in a prison, whether they're in an immigration prison, whether they're in a youth prison, whether they're in facilities that are prisons for disabled people or people with mental health issues. You know, we're using the prison structures to cage those that the state wants disposed of. And we have to draw a line in the sand. And I know there's so many of us around the world that are doing that and connecting. And I think COVID right now, you know, over the last 6-7 months, is giving us some traction to look at how we can build a different world, because people are so isolated in their homes that they realise that they have to rely on their neighbour, you know, to assist, whether it's with food or whatever it is. Where before, you know, I was quite shocked when I came back from New York in March and I had COVID myself, and people were in isolation here and talking about to the media that they'd lived next door to these people for 11 years and didn't even know their name. You know, because we've become so individualised in that racial capitalist world that we only give a shit about property and not people. And I think what COVID's done has flipped that to understand that there's something more in this world than just valuing property, you know, because valuing property is not what humanity is about, I don't believe anyway. You know, like, as I say to people, on my deathbed, if I get to the deathbed, you know, I want my family and friends around me. I don't want to say, I'm not going to say, and I know you're not going to say, damn, I wish I had some more money in the bank, because it actually means nothing at the end of the day, money. You know, that's the myth. And so we have to unpack that, how we've been colonized to think that and believe that, and then can't look at that Aboriginal person there, that black person there, you know, which feeds into the racism, the stereotypes, you know, the mistreatment of trans people, queer people, you know, disabled people. We're all human beings and we've got to come together. The way that I use the law, because there's the broader picture, which, you know, Angela, my sister, connects the dots for us all the time, beautifully. I don't connect the dots anything like her, so eloquently like Angela in the world. But I mean, you know, I'm the activist on the ground doing the grassroots action, but she, you know, she gives us the big picture to move forward in that, and that's what I take on board. But in practice, even though we've got the big picture, you've got to do the day-to-day grind. And so for me, as a child locked up in the system, where lawyers failed me, the so-called justice system failed me. That's why I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted that power that they had, so I can use that power in that system to fight for other people who actually do not have the ability or are too frightened to or powerless to do so, to actually try to ensure that they get a better outcome than what they would if they stood in front of that judicial officer themselves, or stood in front with another lawyer who basically didn't give a fuck about them anyway, because they're just interested in the dollars in their pocket at the end of the day. So it's about that fight, whether it's one person at a time or groups. So, you know, and one of the biggest things is, I know that when I explain to people here at home who's actually in our prisons, they're actually quite shocked, because they've swallowed the law and order rubbish of all the murderers and rapists in there. It's like, yeah, oh no, you know, like the prison system's the murderers and rapists. It's not, you know, and we have to stop labeling people, so, you know, that so-called have violent behavior, because there's no one I know, no one I've ever met in my life that's been criminalised and in prison have ever done things, just something out of the blue, to hurt somebody else. It's been in a context. And when you can talk to someone about that and sit with, just as I did with other women in prison with Storm back in the 90s, to resolve that murder, to transform all of our lives, to move forward, we can all do that. You know, we don't need the authorities to actually do that and give us permission to do that. You know, and one of the things that, you know, I teach my grandchildren, and that we teach the children around us, is to have the skills and the ability to be able to have a conversation if they've hurt someone or impacted in someone else's space and got someone else upset, to give them the language so that they can have a conversation as they grow up to resolve with others. So it's about building a community for the future that I may not see in my life, but I know the younger generation have taken the baton and are fighting now, which is wonderful to see. And they can jump on my shoulders, our shoulders, just as I've jumped on the shoulders before, of strength and leadership to actually move forward. And that movement is getting bigger and broader. And it's so wonderful, the younger generation challenging so many things, even, you know, the way that I think about the status quo, and how I continue to learn every day from young people. And it's just wonderful to be part of that and to be part of young people's lives that continue to challenge me on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, Debbie. I wish we could do this sort of face-to-face, because we could have spent days talking. I mean, your story is amazing, but I know, as Angela keeps saying, that you probably don't want to say like I'm the hero or anything. You know, the movements and people and groups of people, as you mentioned, change things. But I guess you still, you know, you need some people to inspire you and people to sort of look up to. And anyway, you've done something, and you continue doing some things that are amazing. So thank you a million for your time, and we'll be in touch for sure.
Sure, and it'll be great to see you face to face when we can travel again one day.
Yeah, hopefully.
That'll be good. Maybe we can get a room, you, myself, and Angela and others, and have a conversation. And you know, the tragic thing about all this COVID is our 10th international conference was supposed to be here in a couple of weeks, and everybody from around the world, you know, all the abolitionists were coming, and we've had to postpone that. But next time it's on, we'll invite you. You can come down here, come back to Australia.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah, and meet all the young activists here who are particularly First Nations activists, the young queer folk, trans folk, you know, young First Nations folk that are taking this movement forward and fighting the great fight in a very different way that we can do, or I can do now. But you know, it's we're all in this together, and as I say, none of us are free until all of us are free, and so the struggle is real. Yeah.
Thanks, Debbie. A beautiful way to end this.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you, Frank.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye, Debbie. Thanks again.